Hi, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar as we dive into the hidden risks in IT that organizations are facing and look at some challenges and opportunities on how to mitigate them. I am Mary Beth Hamilton, Vice President of Marketing here at DataPrize, and I will be your moderator for today's discussion. A few housekeeping items before we get started. The webinar will run approximately 45 minutes and is being recorded. We will send the recording as well as post-event materials following the following day. And attendees are in a listen-only mode, but we would love for you to submit questions in the GoToWebinar interface so that we can ask them to our esteemed speaker as we near the end of the conversation. Now, just a quick pause in case you do not know DataPrize. We were founded in 1995 and today are the leading strategic IT solution provider to mid-market IT organizations across the United States. We believe that unbeatable IT solutions and services are what allow our clients to be the best at what they do. And we look to deliver these across a range of services from managed user and 24/7 help desk to managed infrastructure, cyber, basically be the end-to-end technology partner for our clients. There are a few other metrics and key things that we like to highlight on this slide, but at the highest level, that is DataPrize. So now, before we get into it, let me introduce my resident expert who is joining me on this conversation, Ryan Miller. Ryan is Director of Infrastructure Management here at DataPrize and brings over 20 years of industry experience across diverse industry segments. He has a strong background in both commercial and technical management and brings a unique perspective and is passionate about many of the topics that we are speaking about today. So I am excited to bring him into the conversation. So Ryan, thanks for joining us.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you everybody for your time today. I hope you enjoy the content.
Next, let's go over what we are going to be talking about today. So across the industry, we are seeing clients look at technology to make technology a business driver for their organizations. But there are some risks and challenges that we often see them bumping into. So as part of this conversation, I'm going to ask Ryan to share his observations and really give some specific examples on how organizations can frame their thinking to overcome these hidden risks. And the topics we'll be looking at are infrastructure strategy and how that aligns to business risks, what we see as some common blind spots within organizations, miseducation on modern data protection, how organizations have potentially thought about it in the past and are changing that currently, how support strategy needs to align with an organization, understanding that users are people and perceptions are reality, and then looking at some strategies and opportunities around smart outsourcing and how not having those in place can introduce risk within an organization. So diving into it, the first risk we have here to talk about is IT and business being misaligned in their priorities. And this is a theme we hear many times from clients, but during this conversation, I really want Ryan to help bring this to life so attendees can make actionable plans. So with that, Ryan, can you share where you are seeing this misalignment in organizations and how that translates into risks?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Mary Beth. So I think that holistically, IT strategy plays a big part of this, and aligning your infrastructure plan, your application plan, your support plan, your oversight and governance plans together is where we see this misalignment. We see the business that is going in a high growth trajectory, and then the IT department is having costs cut, so they're trying to sort of figure out where they can cut corners on their infrastructure to put in place, something that just gets the job done but doesn't plan for the growth. Or, we have the theme of, standardization, buying at the best opportunity on cost. So I think that part of the problem is we see that the business, depending on where they are in this, treats IT as a cost center or treats IT as an also have, rather than in making it an integrated part of the business as a key stakeholder. And I think elevating that conversation helps to make the right decisions along the way.
Excellent. So now let's get into some specific examples on how organizations can overcome these risks.
Yeah, absolutely. So, balancing and priorities, I think, one of the things that we find is that you know keeping current is hard, right? Like there's a large cost outlay to keeping your environment current, your applications current, your services current, and trying to figure out where those immediate gaps are. So sometimes in infrastructure planning in particular, we'll stretch the life of an asset, we'll stretch the life of a service. So I know there's that wireless access points, they're fine, we'll keep them there, we'll stretch them out for another couple of years. And what we end up doing is we're creating kind of an area where there's a risk for things to go wrong. And when those things go wrong, right? Because it's a matter of like if, it's when. It's like the business doesn't have the bandwidth, or I'm not talking about application bandwidth, to be able to move to fix that problem. So taking a look and like a real hard, like an outside look in at where you're at, helps you to identify the gaps and like figure out how the users consume the IT, and if that thing were to disappear, if it was to break, it was to fail, how would that affect the business and where they're going? And then we mark those down as unacceptable, right? Like that's not acceptable. We can't have that in the business. We cannot have the business stagnate. The other thing is kind of up here is kind of strategic wise, is like where's the business going? Like what is the business trajectory and where is it going? Are you consolidating? Are you growing? Are you on a heavy acquisition track? And then figuring out how those activities are going to impact IT and what planning needs to happen at that point. um, the other one here is in standardization and avoid over engineering. It's a topic I like a lot. Bleeding edge versus leading edge. You want to be current and you want to stay, in line with technology as it moves at a rapid pace, but you don't want the latest and greatest thing in your production environment because it's not quite ready. It's not tested, and it may be great, but it's going to give you a larger risk profile, and you want to move that away. So staying current, like one generation behind, is fine. If you want to be on the latest generation, you just need to accept that risk, and if the business is prepared for that, then that's fine. But we kind of like say, like, just wait till it's proven and tested before you put it out into your production environment. The other one, is vendor allegiance versus vendor agnostic. So like some people are very brand loyal, right? I use a car analogy. Some people like Ford, some people like Chevy, and then they'll fight to the death to say like, I'll only ever own a Ford, or I'll only ever own a Honda, and that's okay. But you need to make sure that that aligns with what you need to achieve from your technology. Being agnostic has its advantage as well, where you can say, oh look, I'm not tied to any particular vendor, so function is what I want to derive from. But you've got to kind of like hit this standardization model, and like building a technical architecture or a reference standard is important. They don't all have to be the same brand. A lot of people think that standardization is everything Cisco, or everything Fortinet, or everything Palo Alto. It doesn't need to be that way, but you need to pick each one of those functions of technology and have a standard that works. So it reduces cost to support, it reduces familiarity with the environment, or it reduces the number of people you need to talk to from a vendor standpoint. But that old analogy, don't put all your eggs in one vendor basket, right? Like try and spread out across different vendors for the functions that you need, while keeping on leading edge versus bleeding edge. And the other one, I guess, is keeping the timeline in line with how the business, so keeping up pace, right? I spoke about it just before. If you're consolidating, then what does that mean for IT? And are these the opportunities to get some of those projects delivered and driven out? If you're on a rapid growth and acceleration track for acquisition, what are you going to do about trying to keep up with that? Like, do you need to get ahead of that curve? Do you need to figure out your budgets to put infrastructure in place to so like build it in and they will come kind of sort of mentality, or you're going to try and always try keeping up? um, each one of those has its own risks, and it depends on how what the trajectory of that growth is. But if you wait and you try and catch up, we know there's a chip shortage at the moment in the world, and that's causing delays. If you were just in time driving these things out, you might be delayed 5, 6, 7 weeks if you're opening a new branch or you're accelerating your sort of growth plan. So you've got to take those things into account as well.
Excellent. And I know we get a little bit more into this user support and enablement farther
Yep.
into the conversation, as well as being aligned with the business movements. But before we get into that, let's talk about understanding the risks and misunderstanding of what modern data protection should look like today. So, I recently read an article that said business leaders are becoming less confident in their abilities to recover from a disaster, especially as the definition of a disaster becomes broader. So, in the past, disasters were often associated with natural disasters, weather, infrastructure, etc. But as everyone knows today, those scenarios have changed dramatically. Your disaster recovery plan and backup plan has to account for cyber attacks, political unrest, pandemics, equipment failures, and so many other scenarios. Yet, despite this growing risk landscape, there are studies that have shown that organizations are still not fully prepared. So IDC estimates that only 48% of enterprise applications are truly covered by a disaster recovery plan. So Ryan, can you take us through how you're seeing this play out in organizations and how it creates risks? And then of course, I'm going to ask you to talk about how do we overcome those? But first, what are the risks?
Yeah, so I think the risks is complacency. Complacency is one thing that we see out there in the market. A backup recovery regime was put in place and enacted, 3, 4 years ago, and it's been growing and feeding itself, and it's sort of like taken care of, and it requires little management and maintenance. But that may not be true today of the data and how we need to recover. So complacency in our systems and not taking time to reevaluate is one of those things that organizations don't do well. Better enough leave it alone. It's all working fine. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, kind of thing. Well, taking that time again and it's hard, we're all busy, but to step back and look at it and go like, what happens, again, the not if, but when, if we have a problem, what's going to go on? Like, how is our data protected? Can we recover, and what does that look like? And particularly, when we talk about pandemic planning, which is, pretty relevant today, is, how are we going to get access to data, in the event of a disaster, right? So, not all disasters are created equal. So, not having access to data doesn't mean that there's a recovery issue. It's just like, how are you going to continue to operate your business if people don't have access to all the things they need to do their job because they're working out of their basement, for example? So that's like some of the things that we're seeing at the moment.
Perfect. So now let's talk about how we overcome those risks.
Right. Yes. So, a short answer to a very long conversation. I think understanding how your data is protected now versus your ideal state. So everyone understands that, companies need recovery point objectives and recovery time objectives as part of their analysis for their recovery state. But do you understand how your data is being protected today? Have you done like an audit of or a recovery sort of fire drill to see how long it would actually take to recover your data and what that impact may mean to the business? I think when we look at these, it's kind of like a take stock. Again, I use this a lot, take an outside view in. Pretend you don't know anything about your infrastructure, your data, or your application stack, and come and say, what would happen if the building was to disappear? What would happen if this piece of hardware was to fall over? What would happen if someone cuts our circuit and we can't connect out to the internet? And what if we're not multi-homed or multi-path from our access out? What if both of those things go down? How are we going to sort of react to that and sort of build our recovery stages in there? And that generally highlights a few things that people go, oh, I didn't realize that. Oh, well, we have this core function that we only use once every quarter, right? But if it's gone, it means it's disastrous for our business. So trying to sort of like identify those things, and it's hard to clean the whiteboard and take a view that I don't know anything. But if you can take that, that I don't know anything about the data set, I understand from a business perspective what needs to happen. If I take these things away, which is simulating, what would happen in a disaster, it can give you a good stock of where you're at. The other one is to structure your data strategically. So, I use the saying a lot, not all backup is created equal. So, how you structure your data and how you protect that data and back it up and recover it is important. You don't need hourly snapshots of your archive data, and by the same token, you don't need daily or weekly backups of your key production data. So figuring out how your data is structured, and having a plan on that, and then making your backup and archive and recovery regime based around the importance of the data and what it is to the business means that you have a much more complex backup regime and recovery regime, but it's much more robust for the business. And that takes a bit of time, right? Because you've got to understand not only what all the data is in your organization, but where it is. And sometimes there's these pockets of data that you just don't know about. So that's one way to overcome that risk. Another way to overcome that risk is to put in place multi-stage recovery. So we'll talk about designing for disaster recovery is like everyone understands the old grandfathered backup, disk to disk to tape, now disk to disk to cloud. But what about those services that are sitting out there in the cloud, right? And we talk about things like O365. Any of the data that sits out in O365 is not backed up. Microsoft tell you that. It's in their partnership agreement when you sign it. It's in their service agreement. They say, take a third-party backup of your O365 data. You can set data retention policies. You can set legal hold policies. You can do a lot of those things in O365. They are not backups. All right. They by default it gives you like 100 version of files in OneDrive. Sounds like a lot. Um, Open a document today, share it with like 10 people, 5 people, 2 people, right? Make back and forward adjustments to it. You're up to version 30 before you even know it. Once you get beyond 100, anything that was way back isn't backed up. So having the right way to back up the data and have a way to recover it in O365 is important. SharePoint Online data, sort of goes by the same way. So having a platform, having an application that does that backup for you is important. And a lot of people overlook that because they think, oh, it's up in the cloud, Microsoft's got my back. And that's just not the case.
That is an interesting and I think a very important point because there is a lot of misconceptions that we've seen that it's in the cloud, so it's backed up. So thank you for providing clarity on that and outlining what organizations need to be thinking about that as they're looking at modern data protection with the new risk landscape that they're operating in. So with that, we're going to transition the conversation a bit and talk about the people elements of risk mitigation. So in preparing for this webinar, Ryan, you said some interesting things around organizations really needing to remember that users are people with unique perceptions and perspectives. And so it's important for IT to design strategies and really understand how that person is being impacted by decision and how that person then impacts the organization's ability to be successful. So can you talk more about, risks that not having that perspective can cause? And then as we've done before, we'll talk about how to overcome them. So with that, I'll
Yeah,
turn it over to you.
yeah, for sure. Thanks, Maribeth. So, I have a story that I've used over the years, and it's about user versus person. And if you start to look at your support mechanisms for IT, who uses IT, they're the people in your business. They're not the users in your business. They're the people. It's Mary Beth, it's myself. It's Joe down the hallway that are using this technology. And an anecdote that I always use is, when someone calls into the help desk, let's call her Jenny. Jenny calls into the help desk. Jenny can't print. Now, for Jenny, that's a big issue. Why? Because she needs to print something out, which needs to go for board minutes that need to be done by 2 o'clock. And she's not a user, she's Jenny, and she's stressed, and that people element comes through. And we need to understand that when we're providing support, however that support mechanism occurs, is that there's a person at the end of that technology that just wants to either do their job or have this thing work. And that gets lost. Um, and in losing that, the risk is that to the organization is that as we rely on technology more and more to operate our businesses, it puts our employee base at risk of just going, like, I can't do all this anymore. I just need my things to work, and that they either churn out of the organization, or they get frustrated, or morale drops. So you know it that saying that it's just IT help desk, I really hate that, because there's people at the end of that, and the way that that service is delivered is ultimately important and has much the cascading effects through the organization.
Perfect. So now, what are some ways that organizations can plan for that, think about that, and overcome that risk?
Yeah, 100%. It is about knowing how the current state of support occurs and whether that's the right model. So we talk about, how do people engage support? Do they call up? Is it a walk up mentality? Do they send email? Is it a mobile workforce that's kind of sending tickets via an application? How do the users and people in the business interact with IT support in order to get the support that they need? And again, you'll pick a theme up here, taking that outside view, doing surveys of the business to to figure out how they engage, because you can take all the metrics that you want, say, oh, 30% of our calls come in by phone, come in by phone call, and 70% come in via email. That doesn't give you the true picture of how they engage, or how frustrated they may be, or how happy they may be. So surveying the user community is a real easy way to sort of get a beat on that. Short surveys, a couple of questions around quality, responsiveness, all those kind of things. There's plenty of examples of those out, or we've done this for organizations a lot as well. The other thing is understanding cultural norms. So, how do users consume technology and support in the business? How do users and people in the business interact with other elements of the business? So, how does marketing interface with accounting? How does this happen? Is it people, and COVID aside, is this people gathering around in the lunchroom in kind of informal connections? Are there structured meetings? Is there a blend of all of those things? Do people ring each other up? Do they IM? Do they video call? So understanding how the business communicates and interacts and engages with each other will give you a fairly good view on how they would expect to interact with IT support. And it's important to understand that this engagement, sometimes we've called it, that bedside manner that's required in the medical industry, the same kind of thing. If your users and people are used to calling up and getting, a person on the phone and talking to them, as opposed to emailing in, then that's how you need to structure your support. Now, let's take the migration of that, right? Is that the most effective way for people to be supported? And can we put mechanisms, tools, applications, processes, and all those kind of things in place to make sure that we get a more efficient, interaction with IT support? And that's cultural change, right? That's changes to the business. So again, there's people at the end of that cultural change. So it's education, it's communication, and figuring out how the best way to go about that is. Again, the user surveys will give you a really good bead on what the user community is thinking out there, and how support is active, and what they want to improve. And people on the ground are your best source of information. They'll tell you what works and what doesn't work and what they'd like to see. And from that, you can help to build your strategy out. Again, transformational change in IT support generally has, there's some resistance, there's some challenges there. So my advice would be that if you're going to change the way you engage support, is to have a really good communication plan about what that is to the people who are going to be calling up and accessing that service, and build it in a structured ramp up mode. Like, don't like you can't just cut the cord. You can cut the cord on suppliers. You can cut the cord on who delivers that support, but the model in which they deliver that support is ultimately very personal, very intimate with each business. And understanding that and recognizing that is an important part of the support sort of equation.
That's interesting. And I would imagine to that point of surveying and really understanding support as organizations transition or embrace sort of hybrid workforces,
Mhm.
understanding how you're going to deliver support to employees in the office versus remote, and how that is a long-term strategy to ensure satisfaction in both groups is likely something firms need to be thinking about as they're looking to this new paradigm that we're operating in.
Yeah, 100%. I think that one of the key, outcomes of, remote work and lockdown and that the changing workforce, those modalities are changing as well based on generational sort of factors. So, your younger generation are more, faster paced, connected, via, IM and text and those kind of things as opposed to the phone call. And there's plenty of, empirical evidence out there to suggest that you need to understand not only your support that you're giving, but that within that there's subgroups that are going to engage with that differently. And remote users are generally on non-corporate networks in their home, so they're going to have some different challenges. So identifying those and keeping those front of mind in support is really important as part of that long-term strategy. 100%.
I imagine we could have a whole conversation on that. But before we do that, let's get into our next risk here, which is, organizations across the board, and obviously all of our clients are utilizing outsourcing in some way, shape, or form. But without, forward planning and thinking about how it aligns with the business, there are obviously risks that can occur that you outsource the wrong items, you hold on to things that are inefficient processes that really should be outsourced, or you prioritize incorrectly. So, can you talk through some of the risks that not being strategic in your outsourcing perspective can create? And then, of course, we'll talk next about how we overcome those items.
Yeah, for sure. I think that, COVID-19 pandemic has been a very good example of that. Um, Early days, February 2020, I want to say I was up in New York with a customer, and we were talking about how their business had changed over the last 5 years and how their support needed to modify and how their engagement with us as an outsourcer needed to change. And we were going through kind of a modeling exercise for all that. We spent a good week or two on that, and we came up with a good forward solution for the next 3 to 5 years. March of 2020, we're having a very different conversation with that organization as their 1,200 HQ bound employees were suddenly scattered into their homes. Some of them had decided to go away into different states, and we had a remote support nightmare that they just hadn't taken into account, and not many organizations had taken this into account. So so that was another moment for us to have a look at support and figure out what exactly works. So, there was a heavy on-site presence before. There were, that bedside manner, that desk side support, Joe walking around the office making sure everyone's IT is okay was now no longer a thing because no one was in the office. So, we needed to look at, a more, malleable sort of outsourcing arrangement for them that, we didn't know how long COVID was going to be hanging around and what that was going to mean for the organization and what that was going to mean for the size of their workforce. They were in the medical industry, but medical research. So, were they flipping to COVID research? What were they doing, and how was that going to affect like how are they going to work? People in labs and people at home and all that kind of stuff. So we looked at, I think if anything, we've looked at more flexibility and outsourcing arrangements and figuring out what the right thing is to outsource, but when, where, and how is also very important. And it's, we'll get into that to the next slide, but it's very, it's very different, and building in enough contingency factor for things to switch and turn on a dime, and because COVID come up on us fairly quick, it's going to happen again. It'll be another thing. So how do we sort of prepare for that?
So let's get into, how you're counseling clients to think about these and overcome them.
Yeah. So one of the things that you know, it works well is to, you know, take pandemic planning or DR planning and those things away, is just review the business growth strategy and align accordingly, right? Again, I spoke about it earlier. If you're on a very upwardly mobile, aggressive acquisition track, your IT support strategy, your outsourcing support strategy is going to be very different from someone who's in a consolidation phase, right? And then or they're in a transformational stage, and their business is adding new service lines and items and product sets in there. So one is to figure out the status quo of where the growth strategy and what the business strategy is. Then build scenarios. All right. Well, what ifs? What if the world collapses? What if the economy tanks? What if interest rates spike? What is that going to mean for our business? And then what is that going to mean for IT? And build these scenarios in to look at what IT support looks at. Then across all of those, understand the costs, right? That's the next piece. What are all the costs of these services? So break your support out into different elements. You may have holistic support with an outsourcer, with us, right? But break it out to understand exactly what it is that you need from an organization to be able to say, right, I have my help desk services and my user services here, and I have some residency services where I have someone coming outside, and I have my infrastructure management services, and I have my cyber security services, and break those out into logical lines of technology stack, application stack, whatever makes sense, and then build up your costs and understand what they all are. So, this is often a conversation that happens with cost modeling, outsourcing versus insourcing. And everyone goes, insourcing's cheaper. Well, insourcing on the raw price tag probably is, right? Maybe it's not, but more than likely it is. Then add on all the associated on costs with that, so overhead and workers' compensation, insurance and all of the pieces that make that real estate, power, electricity, all of those things, and figure out what your actual true cost to deliver it is. And then figure out where there may be gaps. So you might have a skill gap, for example. It's hard for organizations to hire all the right people to do it. That's why they outsource. You can't hire zero point 0.2 of a network engineer and 0.35 of a systems guy, and then 0.2 of a help desk person. You can't hire parts of people, and you can't have those roles fulfilled part-time, because what happens in the rest of the time? So figuring out what you need and where your gaps are will help you to identify, if you're doing it internally, where you need to supplement with an outsourcer, or where you need to move that off altogether. And then figuring all of those things out, and workshopping and worksheeting, that kind of stuff. We do this all the time. I've done this for 20 years, and it's the hidden costs that no one knows about. It's the hidden risks that no one sort of thinks about. You end up with a good picture of your financial cost, the delivery and efficiency cost, and how it's going to affect your business, and then make sense of what you should outsource, what you shouldn't outsource. And I hear everyone probably in their heads like, how do you do that? Right, well, figure out why you're outsourcing. That's probably one of the biggest thing. And we'll use terms like, like multi-source. Like, do you need to find several vendors and build pieces of this? Probably that's a sound strategy. It comes with an overhead. Someone has to manage all of those vendors and make sure that they play nice in the same playground together. You can put it all into everything into one vendor. It's good that there's that saying, one throat to choke, one hand to high five. But what does that mean for the support, and how do you make that choice? The other one is, like, determine which mode of delivery you want to outsource and what parts of it make sense. So some organizations, again, depending on where your business is at, we're going to be on a heavy growth track. We've got these projects that are running. How do we keep track of these projects and provide support? We cannot do both. One of them is going to suffer, or more than likely both of them. Which one is the easiest for us? Which one is the lowest interest? I had to say it, but people often outsource help desk because they just don't want to deal with it. That's fine, right? Figure out which is the best way for you to go and make that determination. And if you don't know, put your hand up for help. Talk to organizations like us, talk to a strategic consultant to figure out what that looks like. Um, then I think the biggest piece is, like, what does that strategy look like today? Where does it fit in your growth plans and strategies, sort of like going 3 to 5 years out? Where does that line across all of your scenarios? This is now starting to sound like a big complex exercise. Well, it is, because you're transferring risk to an outsourcer to deliver your services. So you need to hold them accountable. You need to put a governance model across the top of those guys. Figure out what the SLAs are and all that, how you're going to measure their performance, and then you know does that cost stack up? Like, what is the cost to do that with vendor A, B, or C? What is the cost to do that internally? What is the cost to slice that up and give it to multiple vendors? And you end up with this mosaic of how your support should look, and then how your outsourcing should look. And generally, there are the 2 or 3 different modes of how to outsource. Depending on the size of the organization. I think this is one of the key points, is sometimes it just doesn't make sense to multi-source. One, the contracts are either too small for multiple vendors, that you're not going to get the value that you need out of each one of those vendors to provide the support, or two, you're spreading your risk, which is a great strategy, but you're creating a heap of overhead for you to manage that risk. And the last thing that you want to do if you're outsourcing IT services is spend your time managing that outsource arrangement. Like, that thing needs to hum, it needs to work the way that you want it to work. You still have to provide governance and oversight, and there's going to be conversations where something drops. It happens, but you don't want to spend the majority of your time doing that. So figuring out what to outsource that gives you the least amount of overhead that you need to manage is also a part of that equation. Um, you know, I could probably speak about this all day and then some, Meredith, but I think the key, for this is that not every outsourcing solution, not every, engaging with a provider looks the same, and it certainly should be assessed, with a cadence that makes sense for the business, or with a catalyst from the business, like suddenly like I said, you're going into an M&A phase or something like that, to understand, does the outsourcing arrangement that we have at the moment, or the lack thereof, even make sense? And when should we be, looking at making a change? And how do we build that outsourcing so it's a little bit more flexible and dynamic? Um, I can't answer all these questions today, but I think that taking all of those elements and looking at the various perspectives give you a much better information base in order to make a decision and to work with partners to help you get to where you need to go.
Agreed. And as you noted, many of the things that you outlined may feel like a heavy lift. But
Yeah.
once you've built that framework and you've built that strategy and it's aligned with the business, then you have it and you can evolve it as your business changes. And it will also help you identify where to make trade offs and determine how you prioritize your budget as resources start to get stretched. And I also imagine it makes IT be able to have more intelligent and focused conversations with the business when they're asking for items that may not be aligned with either the existing IT budget or the existing IT strategy. And so it's a good framework to go back to that, understand how the organization is prioritizing its investments, and then how that's aligned to the business and the future growth. So you put in the time first, and then you have something, I would imagine, that's pretty powerful that you can use as the company continues to grow and evolve.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. One of the things I think that helps IT with the conversation back into the business is that scenario planning. Like, if you go, this is our plan, it's solid, we got 3 to 5 years, and you have confidence in that plan and you've done your work, that's great. Um, if anything, what the last 12 months has taught us, 12, 14, I can't remember now, 14 months has taught us, is that things change, and planning to have something in place for that change and how to pivot is very important. And like I said, you put in the hard work up front, it's a much easier conversation, because when budget conversations happen, when steering committee conversations happen, all those kind of things, and you've got answers there ready to go, and you can rattle them off like rapid fire. They are like, you've done your homework, you know what you're talking about. This is good. If you go with anything, like if you go unprepared, then you're kind of going to be making it up as you go along, and that's where the majority of the risk comes. If you fail to plan, you plan to fail.
Excellent. And again, this is one of those topics that I think we could go on and on about, but I'm going to pause here to just bring it to our final thoughts slide. If there are additional items you want to share or summarize any key items that people should take away, and then we will go and answer a couple of questions.
Yeah, I think the final thought is view everything with a lens of risk and understand what that risk is, and it helps you to prepare your planning a lot better. It's a complex, world in IT as it is. It moves quick. Technology changes rapidly. Organizations want to get the most out of it. Someone will see something on Google for a Google search and they'll go, "We should have this thing." So just make sure that you keep your plan in your mind with risk in mind, and being able to de-risk any decision that you make through planning will help you sort of like mitigate as much as you can those risks.
Excellent. So that brings us to our thank you and question slide. I've included contact information for both Ryan and myself on here. If you have any additional questions or topics that you would like to cover that we didn't cover, you're welcome to reach out to us. We do have a couple of questions that I'm going to ask before we wrap here. And then also, Data Prize is always happy to offer an IT environment assessment at no cost to take a look at where there may be opportunities, risks, gaps within an IT environment, and what is the current health. So included a hyperlink there, but you're also welcome to just drop me an email if you're interested. And so with that, a question that came through that brings back to something you touched on earlier in the conversation is to that idea of standardization, bleeding edge versus leading edge. How much weight should you put in a vendor's brand when selecting, what products you put in your infrastructure?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Um, Brand means something, all right? So, known name in the industry is something that you should consider into that brand. There's that saying, no one ever got fired for buying IBM. I don't know how current that is today, but it's a kind of that thing. Like you have to figure out the and it's not so much their product, right, or their infrastructure, it's everything that goes around that. So how do they support? What's the quality of their support? They may have a great product, but their support is terrible. Um, so making sure that they're a reputable brand, using things like Gartner quadrants helps, right? People are doing the research. There's analysts out there looking all the time. Lean on their work. You don't have to do all the groundwork yourself. And then when you've got down to a couple of brands, like have the conversations with them. It's a pretty, you're going to get a sales guy, right? And they're going to try and sell you, but just have realistic conversations about the things that keep you up at night, or the things that you have pain on. Touch on those points and see how they handle them. But don't buy a no-name brand, right? Don't go buy something that you've never heard of before, unless it's true, tried and tested, and there's a lot of sentiment out in the community, because you'll end up in trouble there. So you should place some weight in the brand, and depends on what your rating criteria is, but it's up there in the top 2 or 3.
Perfect. And then one last question here, and it builds on that, and in reference to standardization. So if standardization isn't buying from one vendor, what is standardization?
Right. So standardization to me is having a technology stack that you have vetted, however you vetted it, to build out how you operate. So it may be that on the edge for firewalls you've chosen Cisco, right? But for your switching you've gone for something, you've gone for Dell switching, you've gone for Meraki switching. For your access points you've chosen Meraki, for example. It's building out a a a, a series of architecture that makes sense for your business on functionality, price, support, and all those things that we've kind of spoken about. But I wouldn't myself, I hear this, we're, and I don't hate to, pick on any particular brand, but we're an XYZ shop, right? So we only have XYZ routers, switches, load balancers, wireless access. You know, those days, I think, you don't get a lot of loyalty from the brand that you give loyalty to, unless you're a really big player in the market and you're on their radar. So picking what works for your budget and functionality makes a lot more sense. And we've had this conversation with customers where they've gone for the Rolls-Royce brand, and I've literally told them I can get a whole duplicate of their infrastructure and put it away in a cupboard for a cost that will give them everything they need with another vendor. And in these days where every dollar stretches as far as what you can get it to go, make sure that you're spending your dollars wisely to build that reference, and building a multi-vendor approach to your infrastructure stack based on functionality makes a lot more sense.
Excellent. Thank you for that clarification and perspective on that point. So that brings us to the end of our webinar, and we did it in exactly 45 minutes. So thank you, Ryan, for taking the time, and thank you all for attending. As we shared previously, we will send around a copy of the recording, the slides, and any reference materials following the webinar. So thank you again, and we hope to see you on a future event.
Thank you, everybody.